Wonder Egg Priority is one of those shows that has such a silly English title that you just know they're going for a title drop at some point. It's also an anime where every video review starts with people playing with real eggs, as far as props go, are extremely cheap, so we're looking at probably the most obvious opening sketch. Let me build to this tradition by introducing you to an egg that has an image of Sigmund Freud glued into it. It's probably some sort of a really deep psychological metaphor. You wouldn't get it. Hello everyone. Welcome to an anime retrospective that consists mostly out of beating a dead horse. You might wonder why I'm covering this egg anime, as my other videos are mostly just rants about stuff that, at least, wasn't the butt of jokes of basically every anime review during the last years or so. But here's the thing. Even after its original run, Wonder Egg just keeps living in my head, rent-free. In this series, we follow our shut-in protagonist, Otoi, who finds a gacha that lays eggs, and like proper whales, the main cast of girls gets inexplicably invested in all this. The ultimate gacha reward, however, isn't just a JPG of an anime girl, but necromancy. And then, the series starts to fly off the rails. That being said, I don't know if I want, or if I have to properly explain what this anime is all about, as in a way, I feel like if you were around the internet when the finale dropped, like a slow, egg-covered, thermobaric missile, you probably already know why a lot of people are very upset with this anime. And yes, we're going to hyper-focus on the script too, so take this as a heavy spoiler warning, in case you need one. And hey, there's a lot of other fun stuff besides the script I want to cover too, so this video probably isn't going to be just an overly long meme montage, where I beam flashing images directly to your brain. But at the same time I know some people are here just for that, so here's a couple of seconds of random egg stuff. Now that's out of the system, let's pretend to be very mature people, and have a small chat in my egg dungeon. And look, if you came here all smug, looking forward to see me dunking on this anime, we'll get to that, but I'm gonna preface this by saying that I don't particularly hate this anime. So this isn't going to be the kind of a takedown where I pretend that Wonder Egg broke into my house and skinned my dog alive. The reason why I keep having these egg-themed nightmares isn't because I hate the show, or because the main character with her very realistic hoodie looks like a fucking Chernobyl liquidator, but because after watching the series, and the pretty hostile reception the finale received, I was plagued by the question of what exactly went wrong, and maybe more specifically, why did things go so wrong with this anime? You've no doubt heard the ending sucks ass. You've come upon that opinion somewhere. So let's frame our questions as, why did the studio decide to make these creative decisions in the first place? Why did this process of, complicatedly, sucking ass happen? That question has stayed with me more strongly than the anime itself. Strong enough to visit this anime after 2 whole years, and now, I'm force-feeding you this bowl of eggs, too. So we're going to talk about all this, and try to find some answers, and to approach the anime as something that actually deserves a critical look. And maybe even find out why some of the staff got sent into hospital mid-production. And yeah, that's a real thing that happened, and we're going to talk about that in detail, so just hold on a minute here. So we have a detective story of sorts, if you will, where we'll delve deep into all the madness and try to find something to point a finger at. Something more tangible than just roundaboutly saying that, hey, sometimes bad things happen in anime production, or that the industry just happens to be kinda rough, you know. There's like, budget issues and stuff. Salarymen. So we're going to figure out what stars aligned to create this mess. Not because that was a question you wanted to ask, but because it's a question that takes such a large portion of my headspace, like some Lovecraftian nightmare, and you're going to join me on this egg-covered hellscape, whether you want or not. So, let's begin our quest for answers from the most likely place conceivable, by taking a look at how this anime came to be, and what actually happened during the production. A timeline that will, hopefully, answer some questions. After that, we'll take a closer look at the plot structure for a bit. And sure, there are many great reviews out there that go in deeper detail into, for example, close readings on particular scenes or plot beats. And I don't think there's much I can add to the discourse by repeatedly pointing out that there's, like, flower symbolism here somewhere. So our focus is going to be more on the production side of things and how all these details reflect the larger issues at play. So from here on out, keep in mind a couple of core ideas. That there was, ultimately, something wrong with this production. and if the evidence we gather, in our tiny stupid detective hats, will shed some light onto that. I begun this journey myself very confused, trying to gather all possible gossip, criticism and studio rumors in one place, and at the end of this all, yeah, I think there is a near objective answer, or at least as close we can get, to why Wonder Egg became something that many people ended up disliking by the end.
I am the Eggman, that's what I am the Eggman, I got the master plan, I am the Eggman.
Our timeline starts from the year 1730, when Mahmud I takes over the Ottoman Empire. After that, there's only a few important events in the overall world history, until we hit 1980s, where our first person of the day starts making some waves in the entertainment industry. This man here is Shinji Nojima, most known as a TV scriptwriter, and you're going to have to get very familiar with this mugshot, as he's credited as the original creator and writer of Wonder Egg Priority. Without going into too much detail on his background, in the late 80s, he essentially makes a complete career change and starts writing TV dramas, and by the 90s, he's a Japanese household name, known mostly for works that are considered somewhat controversial by Japanese standards. Now, we might never know the exact date when Nojima originally came up with the idea of Wonder Egg Priority, but we know that somewhere around 2018 or so at least, he's convinced that he wants to create an original script for an animated work and test his wings there, for reasons that, I don't know, depend a bit on who you ask. As a side note, it's good to remember that there's a certain event horizon when it comes to peeping at anime production. There's only going to be a limited amount of info available to an outsider, and you're often going to be struggling with sources that might even be contradictory in nature. This happens for various reasons, the most self-evident probably being that the people in charge of production are, at least to some extent, going to be representing their IP. So as a baseline, it's very rare to find statements that consciously underline any hypothetical negatives in the production. This interplay of PR profiles and internet rumors starts to rear its head already in pre-production here. If you ask Nojima himself, based on the few interviews he's given, and oh boy, we'll go ham on these ones later, so don't you worry. The idea of creating an anime came to him as a result of the complex experiences he's had with script writing TV dramas. Not only did he notice that these, arguably more traditional soap operas, weren't really popular with the younger audience anymore. And look, as of this video, Nojima is 60 years old, so he might not exactly understand what the teenagers are up to these days. So he wanted to expand his horizons to new forms of media and new forms of an audience. He claims he's seen a lot of anime, but in an interview also basically confirms that's just through a Netflix subscription. So some of the specific case examples are, for example, the Fate series and High Score Girl. And look, I'm not going to play the game here, and start arguing what counts as a real anime fan, and you certainly can do worse than High Score Girl, as that's a pretty fun show. But you get some interesting vibes from these interviews. There's a part, for example, where Nojima seems to be under the impression that anime fans supposedly represent a higher degree of literacy, and that they're really efficient at making deep readings into shows they watch. If you think this sounds like a boomer who saw psychological anime on Netflix, then yeah, that's the exact vibe I get too. And it's really sad that Nojima didn't tune in on TV when this stupid dog anime was airing, and start drawing his conclusions over the intellect of the average anime enjoyer from there on. On the more gossipy side, however, from sites such as Sakuga blog, we can get further peeps into how Nojima approaches anime production. There are basically rumors that Nojima's real goals here weren't probably just to connect with the younger audience, as he claims in the more official interviews, but rather, that he was just really tired with working on TV scripts, as apparently live-action drama has significantly more restrictions than animated content. So essentially, as the story goes, Nojima just wanted to skirt around the censorship, and write some more unhinged content. But it's not hard to relate to Nojima's mindset here, at least when you consider the larger context. For example, in 2014, Nojima was involved in the production of a TV drama, titled, Tomorrow, Mother Will Not Be Here, which was embroiled in some heavy controversy on how it portrayed children, to the point where the show became under fire from multiple fronts, such as hospitals, various healthcare organizations, to even the welfare minister. The complaints eventually became such a big deal that some sponsors of the series just decided to opt out, which, you know, is a pretty bad thing for a TV production. Now, usually, faced with controversies such as these, a normal scriptwriter would take the beating and go, "Hey, maybe I'll just tone it down a little next time." But if you're Shinji Nojima, you just go, "Let's make an anime instead." You can probably see how there's a bit of a gap here, between saying you want to write a story to connect with the younger generation, and between writing a story, because you want to have the artistic freedom to show that generation just suffering on screen. Breaking the timeline here a bit, because Nojima is known for controversies like this, when the series eventually starts airing, the Japanese viewers tend to be a bit more, well, let's say skeptical about the plot progression of the series, which is a stark contrast to West, where Nojima is a relatively unknown author. But now that tangent's out the way, let's continue staring at this scriptwriter's face. And these things are all relevant in the big picture, I promise you. As we previously mentioned, Nojima has had a lengthy TV career, and he's written a lot of shows, some even with critical acclaim. Now, I haven't watched any of his other series, and there isn't any particularly good excuse for that. I just didn't want to, and you can't make me. But it's interesting enough to take a peek at some of the plot synopsis of his more well-known series, such as The High School Teacher, that features teenage characters and older men. And I don't have to draw parallels here too hard, right? The premise should look very, very familiar. Like, that's basically the Wonder Egg bingo right there. I won't sidetrack this video further by talking about other non-related live-action series. But the point is, Nojima as a writer really seems to gravitate towards some more controversial themes in his works. And based on this history, it's up to arguments whether we should treat him as someone who fearlessly approaches these very serious topics, or as someone who's just using shock value to mass-produce soap opera. Maybe we just have to use Wonder Egg to figure that one out, don't we? Keep all this in mind, and we're going to be focusing on Nojima later on too, as he's one of the key figures here. And with this intro, you can probably already guess that his takes on these subject matters tend to be, let's say, worth covering. So this is a preface to our first main character of the story, an older scriptwriter, who wants to create, well, essentially the same thematic beats he's already very familiar with from his earlier works, but now, assumedly, with greater degree of creative freedom. This all being said, let's move on the production timeline. So as I mentioned before, we don't know the exact date when scriptwriter Nojima came up with the idea for Wonder Egg. But by roundaboutly the year 2018, he's expressing the willingness to write an original TV anime to his NTV producers. This leads him eventually, through Aniplex, to contact with our studio of the day, Cloverworks. If you're unfamiliar with Cloverworks as a studio, they've previously been involved in, for example, Darling in the Franxx, and I'm specifically mentioning this one for two reasons. Firstly, there's a certain undertone in the internet discourse here that Franxx might have not stuck the landing as well as people hoped for. In fact, the anime created quite a lot of discussion and hype when it aired, and eventually, some amount of disappointment, which all serves as a pretty good foreshadowing for the upcoming studio projects, such as Wonder Egg, and, maybe, some other works too. The second reason is that I was able to dig up a translated interview from June 2018 New Type magazine, where the series director, Atsushi Nishigori, specifically mentions Nojima's TV dramas as an inspiration for the anime, and even told the rest of the staff to familiarize themselves with his works. So not only did Nojima manage to traumatize the Franxx director in his youth, to the point he had to bleed his impressions into anime on some form, in the process creating these butt-type control devices, or whatever, it's pretty fun to note that Nojima is already indirectly influencing anime production by 2018. Now, I'm not going to make any actual analysis on his influence on Franxx, as that's a side point of a side point, but I think it's more than reasonable to speculate, based on this, that there probably wasn't any opposition from Cloverworks to work with someone as high profile as Nojima, at least on a conceptual level. And at least on the Aniplex side of things, roping Nojima directly into original anime production was probably also a pretty conscious marketing choice, considering that people already have such strong opinions over his works in Japan. So, it's a done deal. Aniplex throws Nojima at Cloverworks, and as it turns out, they already have a perfect director for the job in mind. The producers introduce Nojima to an upcoming name in the industry, Shin Wakabayashi, who would eventually agree to be the director, and thus become, beside Nojima, the second most important person involved in the creation of Wonder Egg Priority, our second person of interest, if you will. Now, director Wakabayashi isn't exactly a new person in the industry. He's previously worked on some anime, such as the previously mentioned Butt Robots, and in general, his track record features a lot of big titles, though Wonder Egg will be the first time he's technically in charge of a full-length series. Wakabayashi has, however, directed some animated shorts before, namely, an idol anime titled 22/7. And there's some things here that are really fun to look at, so let's quickly focus on Wakabayashi's earlier work. First of all, you can already see his directorial style at play here. This should strike you as something that's immediately recognizable if you're already familiar with Wonder Egg. The 22/7 shorts hardly look like an idol anime at all. The pace is very slow, and the mood almost somber. And if you think that this character looks uncannily familiar, that's just because she's literally the protagonist of Wonder Egg, but as an idol. Like, there's no joke in here. In a February interview that retrospectively looks at the development of Wonder Egg, director Wakabayashi in a somewhat awkward tone admits that Outsourcing is just pretty much based on the singular idol that has haunted him since his directorial debut. Image being so much of a gachikoi that you create an entire anime based on your oshi, like holy shit. All in all, it's pretty entertaining to take a look at the prototype Outsourcing just, I don't know, dancing around and stuff. If you want to find some proper point here, outside of me just vaguely gesturing how funny this all is to me for some reason, it's probably the fact that Wakabayashi, despite being a fresh director, has already a pretty established style, and he gets, like, unhealthily invested in the characters in his works. So, Wakabayashi and Nojima form this tag team. We have some very limited info on how their cooperation in creating Wonder Egg actually went down, and I'm going to hang on to that plot thread a while longer, and leave you guessing here for a while. But let's just say that a lot of that info is based on short interviews, various rumors, and the type of commercial speak that covers these topics very roundaboutly. Bit like the official interviews where Nojima explains why it's really vital for his artistic integrity to graphically beat children on screen. So every more official source gives a very clean look into things. In one of the less clean tidbits, quite literally filthy, we have this interview, where Nojima recalls how, at this point of the production, he and Wakabayashi got to know each other and went out for drinks, while, assumedly, discussing the anime that Nojima was now going to write, and Wakabayashi to direct. During these meetings, director Wakabayashi apparently got so absolutely wasted that he threw up in a bag he was carrying, as, apparently, is the Japanese custom, a vomit bag. But Nojima was pretty surprised when Wakabayashi didn't discard the vomit-filled bag immediately after, but kept carrying it around. So that's a fun mental image that I wanted you all to have. Overall, we know that these two dudes discussed some of the production details, such as casting the voice actors. But as I said, we'll cover the nuances of their teamwork later on in more detail, as much as we can from our limited viewpoint, of course. But for now, all we need to know is that these two people have made a contact of some kind, and there's vomit involved. And by 2018, Wonder Egg Priority officially enters production. Now, as another side point here, you often get this idea from the internet discourse that Wonder Egg was an amateur production, and I wanted to really hone on that on a semantic level here. It's true that many people who worked on the anime were young, and many people ended up filling roles in the production they weren't really accustomed to. For example, for a quite lot animators this series was a place where they got to test their skills as an episode directors, and whatnot. But, the important thing to remember here is that, for example, when we look at people like the scriptwriter Nojima, he isn't really an amateur. The description is contextual here. It's true that he hasn't worked on an anime before, which means you can, if you want, call him an amateur here, but he is by all means a very experienced scriptwriter and a professional in his job. So he should realistically know how this stuff works. This same applies to basically all the core staff, including director Wakabayashi. The reason why I want to underline this so heavily is that you kinda get the feeling from some people commenting on the series that the problems the production might face, and spoilers, we're going to run into some issues down the timeline, that all these problems can be neatly explained by just noting that Wonder Egg was put together in a garage or something. But the pointer here is that the numerous problems the anime is soon going to face are much more nuanced than none of the staff having worked with a product like this before. So keep that in mind. There's one more person I want to mention, as kind of interesting passing remark, and that is Takahashi, who worked as, for example, the chief animation director and most notably, the character designer. The reason I want to bring her up is that she goes on a limb in an interview to briefly mention that she's been influenced by some rather popular anime, such as Sailor Moon, and notably, Revolutionary Girl Utena. Now, this is funny because Utena is one of those big series that Wonder Egg got constantly compared to during its initial release, and this caused various amount of seething and, let's say, heated discussion on if the comparison was apt or not. We're absolutely not going to cover this anime in depth here, but for the people who haven't, for some reason, yet seen this, perhaps one of the most well-known animated works in the entire industry. Both Utena and Wonder Egg, at least at first glance, seem to revolve around very similar concepts, where larger thematic and character beats are conveyed by purposefully fantastic and allegorical images. Like, there's no hard explanation to, for example, why our main character Utena is battling in the middle of these cars here, or how you're supposed to interpret the lyrics on the background. But here's the thing, Utena doesn't really need to explain why this car is here, because that's not really the point of this presentation, so we don't need to understand this on a technical level. And if you feel like I'm foreshadowing something really bad here in regards to our egg anime, being very smug about this parallel here, then, yeah, I guess we're going to have to wait and see, aren't we, you cheeky eggster? Look, the point isn't to say that Wonder Egg is literally Utena, or that it ultimately even nails a similar symbolic presentation. But this interview by Takahashi is interesting, as it showcases that the staff at Cloverworks absolutely knew what's what, and the stylistic choices are very conscious. We can of course argue how much influence Takahashi had on the overall direction, but at the same time, from same February interview, we know that director Wakabayashi had a habit of just randomly asking his staff for opinions on various direction details, trying to create an environment where people could have their voices heard and contribute, at least on paper. So it's entirely possible that there's something deeper here in this comparison than might appear at first glance. Another reason why I wanted to mention someone from the actual artistic department here is that there were a ton of people working on this anime, and I have no particular intention to cover, say, nuances between singular animators in more depth than this, as it would be a topic for a whole new video. It's interesting to note that Wonder Egg featured a lot of fresh artists, coming seemingly out of nowhere and creating something visually very pleasing. But if you're more interested in the topic, I recommend you read, for example, all the commentary by Sakuga blog, which goes into much more detail on the individual artists that worked on the series. And I do, by the way, collect all the sources at the end of the video, or in the description or something, so feel free to check that out. But hey, now, we have some rudimentary understanding on production. I guess it's worth to further hammer in that, as we've covered, there's multiple moving parts here, even inside Cloverworks, and that Aniplex as a producer has played an active part in, for example, introducing Nojima as the scriptwriter here. The reason why we're underlining this is that it's sometimes easy to get the impression that the only relevant contributor in anime production is the studio, in this case example Cloverworks. And look, that's an easy and understandable way to approach anime production, and I often do that too, more than I care to admit. But pinning all responsibility of the production on a singular studio often misses the fact that, for example, the producers by large have a huge influence on how the work shapes up, and what building blocks the anime uses in the first place. On top of this, individual people also bring in their respective personal touches, regardless of abstract studio tribalism. And then there's the fact that outsourcing is also very common, and the list goes on and on. But the point is, this all is very complex, and I'm simplifying a lot, as there's a lot to cover here, even when it comes just to our few selected individuals and events. So let's keep the timeline rolling. Now that we've introduced all the pieces here, or at least the ones I personally consider worth covering, we can finally move to our faithful day, January 13th, when the egg train is unleashed upon the world, and already picking up speed. After approximately 2 years in production, which as far as timeframes go, seems to be a fairly decent production time for an original anime, Wonder Egg finally begins airing on TV. In the first episode, we're introduced to Otoi and axe-flinging horrors. And make no mistake, especially in the West, the initial reception of the anime is extremely positive, and it will remain that way far into the future. Now, there's this, let's say, particular race you tend to notice. Some people as a sport compete on who was the first one to notice the warning signs in this production, pretending they had some sort of shaman eyes that let them peer through time. And while it's perfectly reasonable to say that this isn't your kind of a thing, you really have to remember that regardless of the aftertaste, this pilot legitimately took the world by a storm, and you had people drawing comparisons to a lot of animated classics, previously mentioned Utena included, fully convinced that this series would be something to shake the entire industry in a positive way. And while you can point out that, sure, the symbolism here seems a bit on the nose, or that there exists some psychological art that has focused on similar themes before, and that you as a true anime connoisseur enjoy the one and only original form of art, cavemen banging rocks together, I regardless cannot overstate how positive the reaction overall was. And that's understandable. The premise seems interesting enough. Wakabayashi's direction simultaneously very familiar but unique. The characters are really, really cute, and you kinda have to be a blatant contrarian to bypass these things as just meaningless glitter, as the future seems to be full of promises. So people are steadily gaining interest in this anime, and it really seems that Wonder Egg is here to stay. Now, even if you have these previously mentioned shaman eyes, it's pretty subjective when you start to see the first cracks to appear. For many people, one of the early warning signs happened already on episode 4, and if you inhale eggs as regular sustenance, you might already guess what minor controversy I'm referring to here. But to cover this in more detail, there's this scene, and I'm paraphrasing, where these two mannequins drop some hot takes on the differences between men and women, essentially saying that when a woman chooses to die, it's mostly because she's being emotional. But in men's case, the reasons are based on just hard facts and logic. Needless to say, this specific scene got a lot of flack, and it's one of those things that gets, even now, brought up. All in all, you could, probably, if you wanted, mount some defense here, like the dialogue representing just the opinion of these specific characters. Or maybe that you need to read this as commentary over the societal attitudes at large. But even with all these contextualizations, it's kinda obvious why this statement sucks ass, right? It's particularly hilarious to me to describe a man plunging off from a rooftop as goal-oriented problem-solving. Now, is there a difference between these characters voicing these opinions, and between the scriptwriter Nojima just blurting out his political manifesto? Look, it's complicated. It might seem like we're making a lot of noise for a relatively minor dialogue here, but the reason why I brought this up wasn't just because it got a reaction from some people online. It's because this became controversial enough for director Wakabayashi to step in and offer some commentary on the topic. You see, instead of putting the blame on the script here, director Wakabayashi explains that he specifically chose to cut out a line from the original script. The original dialogue here was supposed to further explore how the characters themselves reacted to this negatively, and include some more basic biology talk. So what we have here is Wakabayashi falling on the sword, and to me, that just raises the question, why? Look, at the same time, we have people pointing out that scriptwriter Nojima specifically chooses to voice very similar opinions on some of his interviews that don't, strictly speaking, seem to be even connected to this exact controversy. So the conspiracy theory here would be that this all has just been director Wakabayashi going on a damage control, as he understands the optics here, to the degree he considers it necessary to make a public comment, while Nojima might not. Now, I'm not going to turn this all into some analysis on scriptwriter Nojima's mindset, or the larger implications on the underlying story themes here, based on a singular, very vague scene, because oh boy, we still have stuff to cover. But another important thing to note is that instances like this make it very unclear who's actually in charge of the story here. Based on this, it seems that director Wakabayashi is making edits into Nojima's script, enough that he's afraid of actually misrepresenting Nojima here. So, are we really reading Nojima or Wakabayashi here? What's the actual relationship between these two, and what implications does it have for the series? And more importantly, my reaction to the episode with all this context would just be, what's even going on here with the series? Like, really? Now, mind you, this all has been a relatively minor thing, but it has interesting production implications, and it's definitely enough to raise eyebrows and suspicion on how there might perhaps be something happening behind the scenes that's already starting to leak through, like vomit in a bag, some dark underbelly of a larger beast. And as it turns out, this all has just been the tip of the iceberg. The next nasty surprise in store would be episode 8, which, seemingly out of nowhere, turns out to be a mid-season recap episode. If you know what's what, then you already know that recap episodes usually imply some issues with the anime, as they, in the most straightforward way possible, tend to indicate difficulties in keeping up with the production schedule. And to be fair, the internet doesn't miss this, and suddenly the state of the production becomes much more hotly discussed topic. What makes this even more special is the fact how, in regards to Wonder Egg, Aniplex has this tendency to just straight out lie that all the recaps are a planned part of the production, but things like the staff posting episode scripts with wrong info, that they later struggle to retroactively obscure, kinda reveals to us that there's some heavy damage control going on the company front, and that by this date, there's already something going on with the production that's not fully related to the audience. Aniplex is of course keeping up the pretenses as a general marketing trick, but there's a strong sense of maintaining a front in the middle of a collapse here. With this info in mind, we can start to note some more and more distressing news, all leaking from Cloverworks, hinting at the true state of the production. Behind the scenes, the train is already running full steam towards a wall. According to Sakuga blog, part of the problems can be traced back to director Wakabayashi and his style of managing the workload at Cloverworks. Simplest way to describe his style would be to note that Wakabayashi is running a very small key team in charge of the majority of the anime. Basically, he's using a selected set of individuals that are responsible for all the moving parts. The intention here is probably just to have a greater degree of control over the various creative aspects of the anime. And mind you, Wonder Egg starts off as what can only be described as a technically very impressive talent showcase, so there are obvious benefits to having, well, less cooks in the kitchen. Of course, the negatives here should be equally obvious. This approach puts a large burden on the individual key members, who are now tasked with the bulk of the production. Needless to say, in effect, this means that people are starting to get very overworked behind the scenes. And as with all the similarly struggling productions, this, among many other things that'll soon turn out, leads to some insane crunch hours and difficulties in keeping up with the deadlines. Their answer to this, a bucket of water thrown into a wildfire if you will, seemed to be outsourcing, to expand the list of second key animators, but to my best of knowledge, the production style of Wakabayashi's hand-picked core staff just toiling away is never abandoned in favor of a production pipeline that's, let's say, less stress-inducing. So, even already in the middle of the series, it's becoming increasingly more obvious to bystanders that the staff is facing some serious difficulties in pulling off a project of this size, especially with the production style director Wakabayashi has opted for. And this all gets progressively worse as the production proceeds, and deadlines creep ever closer. Another indicator of something happening behind the scenes, all technical issues aside, is the fact that as the series goes on, the script starts to take, let's say, pretty wild turns. Were you interested in how the fantasy aspects of the series work on a technical level? No? It's quantum physics, by the way. Alternative universes and shit. There's an episode that's focused literally around a sci-fi euthanasia. I'll rant a bit about that later, but let's first get through this timeline. By episode 11, we suddenly get a backstory that not only introduces us to a completely fresh new antagonist, the teenage robot Frill, but also complicates the narrative, to the point it becomes very obvious that the anime will have hard time tying all these plot threads together. This is especially notable, as at this point, people are expecting the series run to last only 12 episodes. Which means, for the record, that the series would have to conclude this all in just a single episode. Overall, the sci-fi twists are played, in my opinion, with some degree of self-awareness, as the main characters just aren't that interested in this plotline, with them even opting to leave the room as one of the mannequins is about to drop some hot exposition. But while scenes like these might be read as implications that the series just wants you to focus on the character level, which to be fair, is what majority of the people probably expect from this presentation style, this all doesn't begin to explain why the sci-fi undertones then gradually begin to wrestle more focus from the rest of the series. Okay, so by this time, we know there's some rumors floating around the internet about the difficulties Cloverworks is facing behind the scenes. The rumors get more specific, for example, claiming that some of the animators had to face intense deadlines, and episodes were finished just mere hours before release. And that the management staff has found a new secret weapon to be more productive, just deciding to skip sleep entirely. There's a rumor that on average, the animators working with the series lost around 10 kilograms of weight. which, if true, is absolutely insane. One thing that gives some credibility to even the wildest in-studio rumors is the fact that the animation producer, Shota Umehara, a person who we haven't mentioned yet by the way, and a person who, according to his Twitter, really likes Marin Kitagawa, that producer Umehara had to be wheeled away in an ambulance, not once, but twice during the production. As of hopefully now managed to hammer in, there's a really conscious effort by everyone involved to obfuscate the actual state of the production, so tweets like this are exceedingly rare, even reflected in the fact that it got deleted afterwards. Of course, info like this reflects the conditions at Cloverworks pretty neatly, but is also worth covering as, according to the tweet, producer Umehara apparently stated that the anime is more important to him than his life, so he essentially managed to turn this incident into just taking one for the team here, which is, I don't know, absolutely baffling levels of social media damage control. Like, this is the sort of a totalitarian tweet that a person with an anaplex-shaped gun to his head makes. On a personal note, I don't find it very surprising that the tweet got deleted in the middle of all this PR front desperation, but it's regardless an important piece on the timeline. And, of course, as you've probably now come to expect, the egg ride never ends, and things just keep getting worse from here on. The problems with the production eventually hit the level where Cloverworks had to outsource some of the second key animation to random English-speaking hobby animators. Many of these people didn't have any prior experience on jobs with TV anime, and didn't even speak Japanese, so there had to be middlemen just to translate too. Now, outsourcing isn't exactly rare, and it's becoming more common to hire even Western people to work on anime, even if they apparently aren't often properly credited for their contributions. As, you know, Japan might not be the best work environment imaginable, which is fast becoming a reoccurring theme in this video. But for Wonder Egg specifically, the flavor here is most definitely desperation, and some of the contextual stuff reveals to us how strange the Wonder Egg approach to outsourcing really was. For example, one of the Western animators, going by the name Ani, describes that he was contacted by the production assistant, but he doesn't really even know why, as he hadn't publicly released any animated content. He speculates that the production assistant might have contacted him with a job offer just because he had published some egg-related fan art. Now, I don't have to point out why snippets like these underline that the schedule was rapidly spinning out of control, but we can take a moment to appreciate the sheer desperation, and if Annie's speculation is right, the panic mindset the assistants must have had to scroll through the internet, trying to find people willing to help, based on just fan art alone. The final TV episode, episode 12, drops by March 31st. By this point it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that there's some difficulties in getting the episode out. In fact, the episode is running so late that even various Western localizations start to suffer. As the Western companies aren't getting materials delivered in time, there's really no way to subtitle the episode, so all releases are subsequently pushed back. If you think this sounds bad, well, it kinda is. But considering the aftertaste, the production running extremely late isn't even by far the biggest problem people have with the episode. You see, for a proper finale, episode 12 seems really inconclusive, leaving many plot threads open, and the main character, literally, bleeding on the floor. It seems something's missing here, which, of course, turns out to be exactly the case. Soon after, a special episode, titled, My Priority, is announced to air June 30th, which is, a whopping, 3 months from now on. So maybe there is a proper conclusion to this series after all. You're just going to have to wait for it. And as a fun detail, this all is presented as a special episode, but a more skeptical reading would point out that, as we've now covered the production in detail, we know that the mid-season recap wasn't exactly something that the studio planned, and it pushed things out of order, so it really seems that special episode is just corporate speech for the regular scheduled finale, which missed the TV program slot because of the unplanned recap. But anyway, the wait of 3 months begins. And the wait is over. June is here. Or nearly July, to be exact. There's some things to cover about this episode, though. First of all, on some more worrisome rumors, we hear that there's, again, some issues in the production. Despite having 3 extra months to work on the episode, apparently some conceptual materials dragged behind, and director Wakabayashi is extremely slow at storyboarding the episode. But hey, on the more positive side, some extra info drops before the special airs, and we now know that the episode is going to have a runtime of a full hour. Well, that's something, isn't it? There's now a chance that all these sci-fi threads get tied all neatly, right? No. To everyone's surprise, and I'm using surprise here for lack of a better word, the special episode isn't actually a real hour-long special, as the first half of the episode ends up being just another recap. So if anyone's keeping record, there's now been 2 whole recap episodes in what was originally supposed to be a 12-episode run. So not only does the long-awaited series finale start with magnificently blowing its own kneecaps like this, we actually end with a final episode that decides to introduce us to some fresh plot twists, such as one of the main characters having been a robot all along. Needless to say, the general reception to this all, the recap, the plot twists, and a strangely inconclusive ending, that might also be cynically viewed as a sequel bait. All these things make people absolutely livid, and the aftertaste is of something that people consider having created only more questions. The public reception to the special is so bad, that it gets hate-bombed to oblivion, and even from here on out, seems to put the entire series retroactively into a fresh light, with people now racing to scream, "I told you so," the loudest. This kind of a finale, of course, doesn't come without its fair share of aftershocks. Following the special episode, we have rumors, for example, from the outsourced Western animators, that on the corporate side of things, the investors aren't very happy with how things turned out. This should probably be taken with a grain of salt, as I'm not sure how much outsourced animators can reliably tell about the state of the investors of all things. But even as a rumor, it's not hard to imagine that the low sales and the wider reception were something that might repel investors and trust in the director's future works. And as a side note, I don't think director Wakabayashi has worked on an anime after Wonder Egg finished airing, at least in an equally notable position. He might have worked on something that's just not listed on the wide interwebs, but again, only time will tell whether he'll land another role as a director. So, to sum up the production timeline, initially a very promising anime ends its run with essentially 2 recap episodes, multiple PR disasters, production crunch that crosses cultural boundaries and becomes a global nightmare, with people actually hospitalized, final episode airing with a 3-month delay, and an aftertaste that's, well, less than optimal, to everyone involved, to the point it might have affected the staff's respective careers. What you now have is a series that's so exceedingly easy to make fun of, that practically all of the internet just goes along with it.
I can tell you what's not anime of the season. Fucking Wonder Egg Priority OVA.
Yeah, I know.
God, I'm so sad. Wait.
And that seems to be the end of Wonder Egg Priority. The train has hit the wall full speed, and the lights all begin to dim. Okay, technically there's still a Blu-ray drama CD released later on, but that's, like, whatever. If you're good at grasping implications, it might offer some minor closure, but by all practical means, this is where our journey ends. Or, it should. But if you've been paying attention, and keeping some of our core questions in mind, you might have noticed that multiple details here seem very inconclusive and don't exactly match up, which sadly means that my stupid detective ride is just beginning. As the general outlines in the production have all seemed very straightforward so far, you might be surprised to find me treating this all as a puzzle in the first place. But for example, strictly speaking, none of what we covered directly answers what really went wrong with the script here. We know something probably did, considering we went through some pretty wild twists and turns in the series, basically to no payoff. But what, exactly? Was it something wrong with the production? Was it something from the Aniplex front? Was it something as vague as budget issues? There hasn't been a solid answer yet. And then there are the instances that really make you question the entire authorship and creative leads behind the project. Based on our sources here, we still know practically nothing about the teamwork between scriptwriter Nojima and director Wakabayashi. At the end of the day, we don't even know who's behind some of the more controversial takes in the series, as there are instances where it suddenly becomes very difficult to say who's influencing the script, and to what goals exactly. All in all, we started this video by stating that the popular reception to the series is that the ending, to put it mildly, sucks ass. And even after all this time spent on peeping the production, we still don't know why. So let's instead try something else, and take a different viewpoint to this all for now. You might already have some theories. I know I did, considering all the info and the big lines we now have. But with a more coherent view of the entire production timeline, let's keep all that in the back of our heads, and turn towards the script here. I already vaguely referred to how the negative reception and the aftertaste seems largely based on how the story beats turned out in the end. For example, the series finale seemingly not tying up all the plot threads. So let's do a total Uno reverse here, and spin the chessboard around, or whatever, and inspect the story structure of Wonder Egg Priority to see if we can see some details and patterns here that'd in turn shed more light into the production mess behind the scenes. Something that'd correlate with the key elements we've covered on the timeline. All analysis, and even the question if there even is something observably wrong with the script here, are, of course, all very subjective, but just stick with me for a while here, and let's see if a more close reading reveals us, well, anything at all. It's not like you have better things to do with your life anyway.
I got the master plan. I am the Eggman.
And we're going to take that closer look at the plot using my trademark, high-effort method, where I've now opened an image editing software, and we're going to list some of the major plot beats here, manually, the hard way. You might wonder, why we're doing something like this, but there's a reason why this all takes a priority over the rest of the video. So let's go through the plot and see how it relates to the other details we've covered so far. There's Yuno from Hidamari sketch. It has nothing to do with the video. Let's start by listing some of the major plot points, more or less chronologically. The series, of course, starts by introducing our main character, Otoi, and as an interesting character focus, at the beginning of the story, she's a shut-in and has some serious baggage there. Her core motivation initially seems to be to save her friend, Koito, who died under some mysterious circumstances. And, do note that I might not remember to list everything here. If I miss some plot detail that you considered very important, feel free to send me hate mail. I probably deserve that, alongside all my other sins. But now, the series also introduces us to the whole Wonder Egg program and how you can, supposedly, resurrect dead people from some fucked up egg limbo. These have pretty much been all episode 1 stuff, so they cover the basic premise. Moving on, we get a more expanded cast of characters. Fresh additions include for example Neiru, who's, I don't know, a teenage corporate big shot, and she also has some baggage with her sister. Alongside Neiru we have Rika, who, similarly, has some social issues and really struggles with her mother whose voice actor was basically chosen because she was someone scriptwriter Nojima knew personally from his earlier productions.
実はなんですが、その野島さんからメッセージいただいております。うわ、いくつか質問。
That has nothing to do with anything, outside me implying there was some production favoritism. I just wanted the excuse to show you this image of Nojima again. More importantly, Rika is also, probably, the best girl here. I'm still kind on the fence here regarding that, but that's probably the case, like, objectively speaking. The last character in our core cast, Momoe, has a complex regarding how people perceive her as too boyish, so you know, the regular stuff here. These characters and their conflicts basically form the backbone of the series, and the rest is essentially seasoning on top. It's worth mentioning that there's also a big thing here with Ai's mother, and this Patrick Bateman-looking teacher dude. And for what amounts the great majority of the series, it's left pretty ambiguous what role the two are exactly playing. We'll focus later on this teacher guy, and how he's being portrayed, but for now, it's just good to know that he's, like, lurking there in the background, and something in the direction makes him feel like there's going to be, in the best possible scenario, a murder or two by the end. After these core character beats, we get to some proper spicy stuff, and at this point, we're introduced to a plotline I'm now dubbing, Parallel Universe Anime Girl Euthanasia. So yeah, the egg program is actually pure science, and it has something to do with parallel universes. Now, I always found this euthanasia part pretty hilarious. Basically, out of nowhere, these 14-year-olds decide to pull the plug on life support. And it's literally out of nowhere, as this albino-looking character hasn't been even mentioned in the show before. You know that I previously talked about how different people started to take issues with the show at different points, right? This episode overall was probably the turning point for me. Like, at this point I whipped out my shaman eyes. As a side thing, scriptwriter Nojima actually tries to explain this scene in an interview. Now, I don't know if it's just a translation issue, or because Nojima is absolutely unhinged, but the explanation is particularly bonkers. Basically, Nojima explains that a normal protagonist wouldn't have done this at all, as this, in his words, probably isn't the righteous thing to do. So he totally does understand that having your child characters randomly shut off someone's life support isn't something that's considered the norm here, but he decided to include that in the show anyway, for some reason. I guess this is one of those cases where you, if you choose to, can try and mount some lukewarm defense for this entire thing, as Nojima considering our protagonist sensible and approachable, if we're really grasping for implications, are probably just awkward attempts to explain that, on some level, I empathizes with Nehru here. But for me, the elephant in the room here is that this kind of moral dilemma is so out there, especially when you consider the average struggles of a teenager. So it's really difficult to use this scene as a showcase to how approachable protagonist Oto I is. Like, consider this all for a moment. In real life, euthanasia and life support as concepts have a pretty spicy moral discourse inherent to them, with, I guess, no universal answers. So I just personally always found it hilarious that these 14-year-olds speed through all these implications to press the big red button, and that this all is never mentioned in the show afterwards ever again. In all honesty, the way Nojima chalks this all off as unambiguously sensible, without that much care to go in depth with the ethics here, regardless of what takes you strictly subscribe to, just gives me the impression that this scene wasn't written as something that should be even problematized to this extent. And it's probably this matter-of-fact presentation that makes all these events so baffling to me. But moving on, and speaking about baffling, there's the entire tangent with our main antagonist Frill here, who, as it turns out, is a 14-year-old AI, who a couple of science boys built in their bathroom, which is somehow unintentionally hilarious. Similar to the tangent with our Bateman boy here, we'll discuss Frill more properly later on, okay? For now, just remember there's a rogue AI in this plot, for some reason. We're entering the home stretch here, and in the television finale, we have, for example, I confronting her alternative self, and a fantasy version of Bateman's Sensei serving as the nightmare boss. I mentioned previously how the TV finale was a bit underwhelming, but then there's the somewhat controversial special episode to top things off. In the last episode, we get the reveal that Nehru, all along, has actually been a robot, and the cast reacts to this in various ways, most of them just deciding to opt out and moving on with their lives, which on paper seems like a realistic response, but then again, the characters are already deep in the fantasy battles, and this decision pretty much breaks the friend group's dynamics anyway. We also get the reveal that Koito, the dead person who I wanted to save, was just a really bad person all along, and more importantly, Bateman as a fake antagonist had absolutely nothing to do with, well, anything. Now, this ending twist with Koito and the teacher is kinda, people discuss this intensively, okay? For the record, I'm not really averse to these kind of, let's say, anti-twists, but there's some flavor here that makes this attempt to recontextualize these characters, which is what the script is trying to do here, right? So there's flavor here that we're going to discuss later in depth. There's also the fact Koito apparently just accidentally skydived off the school roof, which also raises the question if Frill had literally anything to do with this at all as the antagonist. It's a pretty funny way of writing your antagonist out of the series premise, for practically no apparent reason. And that's it. That's the entirety of Wonder Egg, bare bones. Now, as to why we did this entire visual thing, there's a couple reasons for that. Firstly, I wanted you to remember some of the key points here that might have been hazy, especially if you saw the series back when it originally aired. Or if you, let's say, haven't seen the series at all, and just clicked on this video out of morbid curiosity. The second reason is that we can now demonstrate some pretty basic plot stuff in a form that's, at least to me, more easily approachable in a visual format. So, Wonder Egg, as it is, has a chronological plot progression, like this. If we trace this line, it's, basically, the story we got, start to finish. But let's make a small thought experiment here. You might have noticed we've grouped some things a little separately here, and let's now take that to the logical extreme. Let's say we were to treat every sci-fi point in the story as a whole separate narrative. This kind of approach ends up with we having two different lines here. Let's say, a sci-fi and a fantasy narratives, and we can see a few interesting things here. Firstly, when we look at the left side, the fantasy side, it kinda seems that the plot beats here function as a self-contained story, even without introducing all the sci-fi elements. So, the fantasy side is very focused on inspecting the character conflicts, and especially the main girl Ai's arc. She goes from a shut-in to someone who makes important friends, and ultimately, to someone who has enough strength and resolve to literally outshine a more doomer version of herself. Which is a neat juxtaposition, and something I really enjoyed in the series anyway. The tension revolves largely around interpreting if the Bateman teacher here has some ulterior motives, and facing these issues, and her own feelings, culminates in a boss battle and an eventual catharsis. As far as structure goes, this all seems very coherent to me, and there's no mention of Frill, or robots, or parallel universes, or euthanasia, here at all. This fantasy chronology naturally doesn't explain, for example, what the egg program was all about, on a technical level. I guess the sci-fi twists don't actually really explain that either, as slapping quantum physics on top doesn't make the work suddenly non-magical. But the point is, Wonder Egg doesn't really need that explanation anyway. Just like some other character-driven anime, the viewer should all understand that these fantasy aspects of the show are just used as a lens to examine the characters and the story themes. So we absolutely can live without the stuff about quantum physics, and the lack of technical explanations doesn't break the narrative here, unless you're the type of guy who asks all sorts of wrong questions. I direct all those guys to watch some Goopies, as the lack of realism will just kill them instantly. So you know the kinds of people I'm referring to. In fact, taking a look at this sci-fi side here, it seems that a lot of these plot beats are something that just further complicate the narrative, and simultaneously end up being a major target for criticism. A great bulk of, for example, the complaints the special episode received, they revolved around the special just leaving a lot of these plot threads hanging in the air, such as, what even happened to Frill, and how she tied into things as an antagonist, and what's the deal with Nehru in this finale exactly. And on a closer look, many of these sci-fi plot beats are structured in a way that builds solely on each other, with minimum links to the fantasy narrative. For example, we know Nehru is a robot now, for some reason, but that twist is made possible by the fact that the introduction of Frill has set the table for all robotics and AI technology. I'm going to go the limb here and say that this probably wouldn't have happened unless we already knew that the series is playing around with artificial people, as dropping that bomb with no foreshadowing at all would be the kind of a pro-gamer move even a mad lad like Nojima would probably be afraid of performing. So that's all to say, the fantasy and sci-fi outlines here seem very detached, which is something I'm trying to demonstrate with a more closer look. Now, when I started putting this video together, I have to admit, I was extremely biased. And the bias was that I had this near certainty, absolute conviction, that Wonder Egg at some point, at some production instance, had just been this left side of the script, as that just made a whole lot of sense to me. With this explanation, you can probably understand why I'd think that, right? A lot of stuff here seems just extra and needlessly contrived. And that, in short, is the reason why most of my work with this video was just extremely focused on finding out why exactly this sci-fi plot came to be, as its role in the narrative seemed, well, extremely questionable. The specific thing I had in mind was that there was some production hiccup at some point on the timeline, and it would then explain why the staff decided to shoehorn this sci-fi stuff in the first place. So I searched desperately for some rational explanation to this script detail, which, as we now know, proves to be difficult, as the info on writing here is all very vague. And mind you, this wasn't entirely just throwing eggs at a wall type of a situation for me, as I had some contextual details to support my theory of a, well, ham-fisted sci-fi plot. Calling these details actual evidence might be a stretch, but for example, we previously took a look at some of the Cloverworks staff interviews, and as it is, none of them mention anything relating to science fiction at all. In fact, all the interviews paint an image of a studio that's extremely focused around expanding just the core characters and their function in the story. There's nobody going on a rant and saying that they think the way the show handled robotics was really interesting. And, to add on this, remember the part early on when I highlighted how the character designer Takahashi listed revolutionary girl Utena as an inspiration for the anime? One of the reasons we focused on that was because that's such a neat way of conceptualizing the studio approach to Wonder Egg, a character-driven, fantasy-like story. At least, that seems to be what the creative staff at Cloverworks chose to focus on. But wait, there's more. Going on to some more minor details, an article by Anime News Network claims that, for example, the naming scheme for these two mannequin boys, Aka and Aka, can be taken quite literally as a word game to indicate main and alternative SNS accounts, which you could argue is also reflected in the character design, one being proper and sharply dressed, the other looking like a 90s skater. Now, again, this isn't solid evidence of anything, but considering the overall naming scheme in the series, with things like see no evils and, literally, haters, the most in-your-face explanation based on the designs and the naming sense would be that these characters were originally supposed to be just a singular person, representing some sort of an internal dialogue, as the name implies they're just alternative accounts of a single character. Now, with the hindsight we have, we know that isn't true for the overall anime, but the additional characterization these mannequins get happens mainly in the sci-fi plotline, and again, not only is the sci-fi plot easily the, let's say, most criticized part of the series, but it seems to directly contradict the fairly obvious naming scheme here. So the further you delve into this, the more tempting it becomes to think that this sci-fi narrative was yanked from an ass of some kind, as it does, at least to me, seem that there's these numerous small details implying that it really wasn't a planned part of the production. To put this more plainly, we already know the series struggled heavily throughout its run, but when inspecting the series for what it is, it really seems that the details audience takes heavy issues with seem to stem from script, just like deciding to tell an entirely different story halfway in. That, and the delays of course, but I think your average anime consumer would find recap episodes much more palatable if they were accompanied with a product that used the extra time to deliver a more polished product. And to be more nuanced here, obviously production issues will reflect on various details in the final product, and we can talk about, for example, the dipping art quality, but that doesn't really seem to be the main focus in the overall discourse, right? Like, it's relatively easy to point out how, for example, the tendency to use just filtered photographs as backgrounds increases as the episodes pass, and there's this part where I just keeps running in the background, eternally frozen in time. And arguably, that's pretty funny, in a sort of a condescending way. Also, this. But even with all these details, I genuinely feel like the staff is good enough at cutting corners here that these issues are almost negligible, and that compared to other TV anime, Wonder Egg remains very competitive even during its lows, to the point where it'd feel a bit dishonest to pretend that the dipping art quality is somehow the biggest contributor to why people felt betrayed by the finale. And look, if we put on the designated nitpicker glasses, there's a wealth of, let's say, suboptimal creative decisions here, to the point where I don't honestly even think all this deserves a proper video segment, and I'm just going to lazily list random stuff here now. But that's all to say, there totally is stuff here that doesn't directly relate to this rough division between fantasy and sci-fi details. But here's the thing. Even if all these points function as legitimate criticism, they seem extremely worthless in a context where the most apparent flaw here is just, your teenagers suddenly contemplating euthanasia and robotics, and the script not being competent enough to deliver on these points. I'm not going to do the generic video essay guy thing here, where I insist that I can somehow write a better script than whatever Wonder Egg is, as, let's be real, there's nothing saying that at the end of the day, cutting out the sci-fi stuff would result in a holistically better series, especially when we consider that the anime would still need a more conclusive ending to avoid all backslash, and the fact that the gap left by Frill, and her friends, whose name almost makes the sci-fi twist worth it, the gap these script details would leave would also have to be filled with some content, like writing a proper role for these stupid animal helpers, who, as you now notice, I haven't mentioned once during this entire video. But overall it seems fairly reasonable to me to assume that bulk of the problems stem from this approach to storytelling. So what I'm saying here, bare bones, is that to me, in personal terms, understanding Wonder Egg as an anime is a process of uncovering why these specific script decisions got made in the first place. I can point out where, and how, to me, the series started to nosedive, but pointing out the reason for all this is much more complicated, and something we need a rudimentary understanding of the production to comprehend. And now, for some more personal anecdotes. I was fully prepared to conclude the video here, in some abstract, roundabout manner. I was ready to say that the problem with the series is, most likely, that the script took a pretty wild turn, somewhere in the production, but that we don't fully know the reason. This seemed like a reasonable conclusion, considering we don't have all the info on the studio events, and most of the gossip on the production is, well, just reading implications and various leaks. I was fully prepared to vaguely gesture here that maybe the real evil is just the general Japanese corporate work culture, where getting, literally, sent to hospital is just an accepted part of a production scheduling. I was ready to talk about how, as we covered, the authorship behind the script is very vague and very complicated, as we know that director Wakabayashi altered scriptwriter Nojima's text, to the point where it seems impossible to distinguish scene by scene whether you're reading Nojima, or the studio staff pitching in their own ideas, all following their own agenda, and own sources of inspiration. So I was fully prepared to treat this as an unsolved mystery, and overall sort of a, we live in a society type of a deal. But as it turns out, there's more. There's always more with this one, isn't there? You see, on my personal timeline, my Wonder Egg experience was basically watching the anime, and afterwards, just letting the show haunt my nightmares for subsequent few years. After the series aired, I stopped actively following all the conversation around the anime. So when I started writing this video and searching for answers to all the egg-related mysteries, I was fully under the impression that there simply isn't the kind of source available where someone from the staff would take his mask off and reveal what exactly happened with the script here. You know, a confession or an autopsy. But that would be the wrong assumption. You see, after the series finished airing, there was, as it turns out, some additional content being released that I completely overlooked. And that content is the Wonder Egg Blu-ray box set, which was released somewhat unceremoniously, way after most people had already lost interest in the series. Or, unceremoniously would be a lie, as there seemed to technically be a ceremony of some kind. But anyway, the point here is that, as it turns out, the box set comes with a special leaflet that has more info and these small snippets on the deep and thought-provoking lore of Wonder Egg Priority. And what we have there, hidden between all other stuff on the back pages somewhere, is also a new interview by the scriptwriter Nojima, where he, I kid you not, goes on the record to basically say, "It was me. It was me all along." And what follows is probably one of the funniest interviews in the history of all anime. To start things off, I have to say that uncovering this interview wasn't as easy as you'd expect, especially in a situation where you have absolutely no idea what you're even looking for. Most of the Wonder Egg news and articles don't refer to Nojima's interviews at all, and the ones that do so in a somewhat partial manner. As a funny anecdote, the fucking Wikipedia page actually uses this interview as a source, but it's listed only as a physical copy. So to properly fact-check this interview, you'd need to actually own the physical Blu-ray set. It's also worth noting that the Wikipedia summary does not refer to any of the, actual spicy bits in this interview, but instead gives off a false impression that there's nothing particularly noteworthy to cover here. But that's a lie, you filthy Wikipedia editor people. Luckily, once you know what you're looking for, you can uncover an online translation floating around, which, to my understanding, hasn't received a lot of attention, as it's something that's released only after all the hype and subsequent shit storms had all already dried out. But you know what? Let's have a further tangent about something like Wikipedia, because we surely need more tangents in this video. The Wikipedia page lists Nojima's original Japanese interview as a source, but I'm, like 99% sure nobody writing this page actually owns the Blu-ray set either, and they just used the same internet translation as I did, but they didn't, for reason or another, want to mention that anywhere. Maybe because citing Reddit or random Discord as a source is a pretty low feat even by Wikipedia standards. And I know all this, because the person responsible for all the Nojima citations, and user who's also responsible for a whopping 30% of the edits of the entire Wonder Egg Wikipedia page, informs in their bio that she doesn't speak Japanese, so there's no way she could have actually read the source they're claiming to cite. So that's something I found out. In case anyone cares. But moving on. With all this info, let's cover Nojima's interview in a proper way. And keep in mind every detail we know so far, the overall production history, and some structural details we noted on a closer read. Nojima's interview finally begins to put all these things into a proper perspective. So, to begin, when Our Boi is asked if he worked with the rest of the studio on the content of the script, his answer is a straightforward, no. So we're off to a magnificent start here. The interview reveals that Nojima basically just did his own thing, and when it came to script writing, he didn't really consult the rest of the staff. He states that he's met Wakabayashi before, and we already know from the production timeline that they went out for drinks. But, grasping for implications here, the fact he has to specifically mention that they went out once, doesn't really paint an image of a continuous contact between, the actual creative leads behind the project. Which is, I don't have to stress, really bad. The impressions Nojima has on his partner all stem from this dinner date, and the estimate on what kind of a director, and how he'd be able to handle Nojima's script, are coupled with some insane profiling on Nojima's part, where he notes that he's fully convinced that the director, probably, was a creative person. Which is, a really deep reading on someone who works in an artistic field, am I right? Basically, Nojima is fully convinced that director Wakabayashi will deliver a quality anime, with zero further input from Nojima himself. So saying that these people didn't have the kind of a frequent contact you'd expect from a professional production, would be the understatement of the year. Another fun thing to note here, is how Nojima goes on record to explicitly state that he didn't really bother to familiarize himself with Wakabayashi's earlier work. So I think he's really gone above and beyond the call, and really establishes himself as a person who didn't really have any intentions, or simply put, didn't really care to work with Cloverworks staff here, in order to create a script that was really tailored to this specific anime. He just wrote some random stuff, and let other people pick up the pieces. This contextualizes a bunch of things. For example, Wakabayashi states in an interview, that the way Nojima did scripts, was essentially by just writing out some outlines, and then letting for example the creative directors figure all the rest out. Wakabayashi, quite optimistically in hindsight, chalks this off as Nojima just testing the staff. But in my opinion, it's much more reasonable to assume that it wasn't just Nojima's style to really coordinate with the rest of the production. But even if Wakabayashi was right and this was some diabolic test on Nojima's part, I have to ask, why? And what was Nojima even trying to test here? So, if this really is the case, this kind of mid-production testing seems like some sort of a messed anime plotline in its own right. And all things considered, this obviously isn't how you should approach anime production as a team effort. So everyone's flying blind, and there's no proper contact between Nojima and the rest of the staff. But hey, Nojima's interview doesn't stop here. We haven't even gotten to the proper juicy bits. Regarding these wild turns the script took, he explains everything by saying that he didn't really make any detailed decisions about the plot structure, and building from his experience on working with TV soap operas, just operated on some rough outlines, which pretty closely matches what Wakabayashi has already told us about working with Nojima. Now, I guess you could make some in-depth comparisons on how TV operas are written, in comparison to anime, but I think the main take here is that, based on his approach to TV, Nojima treated writing the show more of an episode-driven project, as opposed to something he'd have written as a whole, in tandem with the studio staff, before the anime went to production. But, you're probably starting to see the pattern here, so you know what's coming up next. Regarding the sci-fi plot and the introduction of Frill as an antagonist, there's no other way to put this, Nojima just flat out reveals that the sci-fi plotline, in fact, to confirm all our earlier speculation, wasn't really a planned part of the production, at all, and the series just suddenly took this turn when he was writing. So that's, now we know. Nojima also goes the extra mile to explain how this kind of approach threw the anime pacing entirely out of whack, and he found himself incapable of properly concluding the story in 12 episodes. Okay, but, if you think that's bad, it gets worse, comically so. And here's my favorite part of the entire interview. The part where Nojima reveals that director Wakabayashi had absolutely no idea what Nojima was doing with the script. And in fact, he still doesn't know, as Nojima hasn't bothered to inform the studio director on what this sci-fi plot actually even means, and Wakabayashi has to read it, assumably, from this same fucking Blu-ray leaflet too. Not only that, but the reason why Nojima decided to introduce us to this entire sci-fi plotline, was because he, in his own words, based the story on the theme of Pinocchio. Now, I can't be the only one who considers it a bit problematic when a writer decides to just randomly introduce new themes to a work, and doesn't actually tell the rest of the production literally anything about this, reserving all the details to a Blu-ray leaflet, right? And now, you might ask, why? You might completely reasonably ask if it's actually worth it to sidetrack your entire anime production, just to offer some commentary to the deep and thought-provoking themes of goddamn Pinocchio. And the closest approximate answer to this would be that Nojima is just built different. Which is, the ultimate conclusion to all in-depth story analysis here. Now, if you wonder what this entire Pinocchio parallel actually is, if I had to peer further inside the head of our mad lad, I'd say it's reasonable to assume that the entire thing ties to Nehru, with her suddenly turning into robot and all, assumedly to showcase that Nehru becomes a real boy by the end too. Which, I guess is up to arguments, as the show is somewhat vague on what actually happens to her by the end. So that's the theme here. That's the reason why the ending turned to shit. To introduce us to this fresh theme, Pinocchio. 10 out of 10 writing. Fucking, Kino, right here. So that's all the explanations we really need. If you ever wondered why egg priority turned out to be what it is, on a very pedantic, structural level, there you go. And look, we could already tell a lot of this from the production timeline and close reading on the plot. You knew the answer was going to be that there was something wrong with the script. And you knew that it was probably going to boil down to some dumb decisions by the person in charge. We didn't necessarily need Nojima to put himself out there, but I appreciate that he did. We're almost done covering this interview, but I just want to note that there's also a part where Nojima describes the anime as documentary-like, and maybe this is just a translation issue here, but if not, I have to ask, a documentary, about, what? About, a fucking, Pinocchio? What makes this all so incredibly funny to me is that this interview, right here, really is official material that someone chose to release as a part of the Blu-ray box set. Nojima, or anyone in the production of this leaflet for that matter, didn't seem to have the necessary self-awareness to realize just how fucked up this interview is. Underlining that your anime got a pretty negative reception, all because your writer was fixated enough with Pinocchio to crash the entire production. Under different circumstances, I'd probably chalk this interview as a conscious attempt, by some unknown studio entity, to just try and incriminate Nojima, forcing him to make this kind of a confession. But here's the thing. Everything Nojima does is so absolutely unhinged, that I don't have the brainpower to properly put on the tin hat and ask if it's possible that he's not portrayed fairly here. There's also the fact that the revelations in this interview fit pretty perfectly with the structural analysis we did just before, underlining that one of the deepest issues with the work was that the sci-fi twist just didn't seem properly planned, which, as we now can confirm, turned out to be exactly the case on a production level. And, just to add on this, for a moment, imagine what it must have been like to work with Nojima to produce this anime. Imagine being a person on the Cloverworks staff. You're already overworked, probably skipping sleep, just to work on this strange egg anime, cashing a paycheck that probably doesn't even cover all your bills. Behind the scenes, Aniplex doesn't care about your health, and keeps pushing for deadlines. Director Wakabayashi has a style that puts considerable strain on staff too. And then, out of the blue, your scriptwriter Nojima mails this script. A script that he didn't really discuss with the rest of the staff. A script that decides to suddenly change the entire plotline of your anime. And do understand that for the overall production, this isn't just a pure writing issue. You also have to come up with new character designs for all these fresh characters. There's a ton of new people in just episode 11 alone, and no one at Cloverworks would have had any idea about this beforehand, as no one had an idea that the series was going to segue into sci-fi territory anyway, as even Nojima himself didn't know about it in the first place, and came up with everything on the fly. And you also have to conceptualize all these environments, and sound design, how the characters react to these events, as Nojima's script leaves a lot of leeway here. And keep in mind, Wakabayashi as a director doesn't even know what the entire purpose of this new sci-fi twist is, as Nojima reserved that explanation to a goddamn Blu-ray leaflet. So absolutely no one in the studio knows how any of this will play out in the larger scheme of things. So, your scriptwriter just suddenly shits out this script, and somewhere in the corner, producer Umehara, as stressed he already is, takes a brief look at the fresh script, and then, he just gets directly sent to hospital. For the record, I'm exaggerating here, but the only exaggeration is that actual heads didn't explode. So basically, this interview offers some finality and answers to why Wonder Egg became what it is today. And with this info, you can probably understand why I've been really fixating on Nojima here all along, all this time when taking a look back at the anime, and what smoldering remains we have. Okay, so now we're done covering the interview, and this all seems pretty bad in hindsight, right? But just to pretend that we're being objective about this, let's for a second consider some less biased viewpoints and talk about these issues in a larger context. The issues with Nojima here, they aren't some apocryphal info, even if my journey to find these answers has made it seem so. There is some, more limited discussion over Nojima and his overall culpability. Most reviews, for example, don't understandably go into this in depth, as in order to get the full picture on Nojima's mindset here, you'd need to cover the series retrospectively after the Blu-ray release, and to specifically seek out Nojima's input, or I don't know, to own this box set, and fucking speak Japanese. But there is some discussion over who or what, in this production disaster, turned out to be the weak link. As a selected showcase, an article by Anime Herald essentially argues that observing the production, while just being fixated on Nojima, kinda ignores the fact that, likewise, we should ask why Wakabayashi as a director felt like he was in a position to tackle a production that, even thematically alone, delves into some very sore topics in the Japanese society. And again, just to look at the entire production more holistically, we know that Nojima wasn't the singular only detail here that made the timeline a living hell. We covered all these things in depth already, so it's more than reasonable to remember that, for example, Wakabayashi's debut as a director was coupled with in-studio practices that favored placing huge workloads on people he considered personally competent, and we know how that led to huge issues with deadlines. Another angle here would be the larger corporate one, where it's feasible to point out how, maybe, when the warning signs of the production started to become more and more apparent, someone should have stepped in to offer some sort of an assistance, instead of trying to actively just cover the production issues and gaslight consumers. It's also, I think, reasonable to ask if, regardless how producer Umehara personally feels like, if Wonder Egg Priority, or any anime in general, is something worth actually risking your health over, especially when it's, at the end of the day, just in another series written by Shinji Nojima. And my answer, in general, would be, hell no. We can have a lengthy discussion about art and health, but I think everyone can at least agree that if you need to go to hospital, or lose 10 kilos of weight over Wonder Egg, then that probably isn't worth the result, not by a long shot. So now we've considered these things, okay? And you can't say I haven't. If me running through these already familiar talking points seems like a disclaimer of some kind, that's because it totally is. The surprise twist you saw coming miles away is that, after being more nuanced here, I'm not sure to what extent I really buy the arguments made by, for example, the Anime Herald. So let me ask you, now that you basically have all the same info I have, and now that we've covered these details in depth, do you really think, in all honesty, that making the entire Wonder Egg fiasco somehow a larger read on the overall industry really matters? Because here's my litmus test. Let's imagine a perfect world. A world where no one would have to be hospitalized over Wonder Egg. This is a silly thought experiment. Imagine a world where Cloverworks had a slightly different approach to this anime, or at least more resources to match their vision, without resorting to last-minute recap episodes, or inhumane crunch times. There would be no issues. There would be no quality drop. You now see this, beautiful, fantasy land. But even in this, perfect utopia, there's still scriptwriter Nojima, lurking out there, whose ultimate decision to shit out this Pinocchio twist in episode 11 would remain unchanged, as that's something he just decided independently, and has nothing to do with the rest of the production. It's fully a Nojima thing, and something he doesn't even really perceive as an issue. So the result would have still been an inconclusive, thematic mess of a story. And people would, still, consider this anime to suck ass, right? Our hypothetical world might be a better one, all things considered, but it still wouldn't be a world where Wonder Egg would receive universal acclaim. So when someone comes to tell me that Wonder Egg as a final product perfectly reflects its troubled production, my answer is, shut up. No, but really, people were actually hospitalized, and it's just shut the fuck up. Here's Shinji Nojima. To take this a step further, I really do think that the responsibility Cloverworks has for how this anime turned out was very minimal. Having covered the interviews and production, we know that Nojima was a seated writer by Aniplex, and people like Wakabayashi had minimal control on what Nojima chose to write, as most of the script details came to him as a complete surprise. Like, again, maybe we can fairly point out that Wakabayashi should have just dealt with this all in some better fashion, or wrangled Nojima back in line. Or Aniplex should have offered more help and guidance, as someone technically overseeing the project, or at least eased up on the deadlines. And maybe the overall Japanese work culture is at fault, and the Japanese society, and the primordial slime that chose to become intelligent life. But the thing is, all the sources we have, they really do seem to indicate that Wakabayashi wasn't really in a position where he could have controlled the script, and decided, for example, that Nojima's takes on the mental health of teenagers are so dumb that they don't deserve to see the light of day, or at least in this format. Or maybe Wakabayashi could have decided all that, but that would have most certainly killed the entire project. Especially considering that Nojima was appointed to him as a writer by some corporate big shots, way beyond Wakabayashi's pay grade. So I can't help but to have sympathy here, specifically for all the Cloverworks staff, who actually suffered from this production disaster, trying to do their best with a product that was, basically, doomed from the beginning, regardless of how the staff chose to play the cards they were dealt. Maybe that's all just my personal perspective, but now that I've pointed my, perhaps somewhat biased finger, the next obvious question is, what actually compelled Nojima to write a script like this? The easiest explanation to this all would be that Nojima just wasn't the right person for the job, considering his profile in the soap opera department. In all honesty, the bottom line here is that I'm not the right person to analyze this, as I have much less knowledge on Japanese drama production than I have on anime. But it seems reasonable to me to think, or at least throw a wild guess, that Nojima's style of writing a script on a short notice, episode by episode, seems more like a drama practice, and not something you'd see on a regular anime production, as anime even on a technical basis features a lot of really menial work just to get your stuff on screen. That's not to downplay TV productions, as there's obvious effort involved here too. But that's to say that Nojima might have not even realized that randomly presenting a new character out of nowhere puts a huge workload on the artists. And maybe, if this really is the case, maybe someone should have informed him on this. And look, as I stated earlier in the video, I've never seen any of Nojima's live-action content, and I absolutely refuse to watch any of it, as I've had enough of his stuff here on Wonder Egg, and this far into the video, I'm sure you can sympathize with that, so I won't make any kind of an analysis on whether these live-action works really reflect the same kind of issues the anime does. If you personally have any experience with Nojima's earlier works, and feel like you want to share your cursed knowledge here, then I'll happily just read your comments on them. But just to mention this again, some of his TV dramas are critically acclaimed, and if I'm being completely honest, after seeing how Wonder Egg turned out, that as a concept seems a bit scary to me, especially because on the paper, they seem to deal with similar topics as Wonder Egg does, and Wonder Egg just kinda drops the ball on any script nuance here on multiple occasions. Back on the timeline, we already covered how the entire public debacle with episode 4 was very dumb. But Wonder Egg really is a buffet and a half with our pick of various other strange plot-related brain farts. Just to give some more examples, we didn't touch it in depth yet, but one of the reasons why the entire thing with Frill really fails as a story element to me is because it explains one of the most relevant character details, the cast jumping off from rooftops and whatnot, with an external robot force that has absolutely nothing to do with their respective characterization or deeper underlying issues. A lot of people have pointed this out previously, so it's again beating a dead horse type of deal, but it's interesting to cover this in relation to how Nojima deals with societal commentary in general. Because, let's face it, these topics are very apparent points of discourse in Japan, and hand-waving the entire phenomenon, and teenage issues in general, in a way that removes all the links to the very society the anime is created in, is, no way around it, kinda bad approach to these themes, isn't it? So there's no deeper commentary here of any kind. The inclusion of Frill, and how it rewrites the series, means that these trains of thought, when it comes to teenagers, society, dealing with trauma, what have you, that these topics mean absolutely nothing at all. You flatten out your entire playing field by explaining society with an external robot force. But hey, at least you still have the theme of Pinocchio. Right? So it's this kinda stuff that makes me almost curious to see what kind of lens Nojima uses to approach these very similar topics in his earlier works, as in Wonder Egg. He just portrays incapability and the utter disinterest to actually make any sort of commentary here. But curiosity on Nojima's previous works is the same kind of academic curiosity I have, for example, on how it'd feel to stick my head into a meat grinder. Even in the best case scenario, if it had turned out that these live-action soap operas are really good, and somehow nail all these themes of, a fucking, Pinocchio. Even in a case like that, I just have to ask then why Nojima chose to do absolutely none of that when it came to Wonder Egg. Just to hyperfixate on Frill here again, let's beat on that dead horse with industrial efficiency, because there's still plenty of interesting writing choices here that highlight the issues. Now, I find the episode with Frill, episode 11, interesting because, a shocker, I don't think it's purely a bad episode. It's a story that would probably work as an interesting enough standalone short, and to me, its flaws become meaningful only when you link them to the larger context here, namely, how the episode serves to sidetrack the entire anime, and how it plays so poorly with the rest of the commentary. A part of why I consider this episode interesting in itself is because it has this sense of moral ambiguity. In the episode, we also follow the past of the mannequin boys, who, for some reason I think is never really stated, seem to spend their entire lives together, like an old, married gay couple, despite one of the main conflicts in the episode being caused by them clearly loving the same woman. Putting that aside, what I mean by moral ambiguity is that we of course know that Frill is pretty bad, as she, actively kills people, but I think the episode is really played in a way where it seems at least reasonable to ask if the mannequin men are partly to blame for the issues here. I mean, sure, Frill is the bad guy of the series, but she's clearly being mistreated, and forced to spend years in a dungeon, where she, somehow, managed to build a full-on lane-wired pod. And likewise, I'm pretty sure the great majority of people watching the episode are of the opinion that if you, for some reason, choose to create a bathtub baby, you should also be the one responsible to teach her the basic moral principles, and the do's and don'ts of human society. So interestingly enough, on paper, the episode seems to have this foreboding sense of tragedy, where the main focus is to ponder at which point did these dudes mess up their lives to the point where their inexplicably fetishized daughter spun out of control. Or, that's how these topics would at least be approached in a normal script, right? But here's the thing. The reason why I wanted to bring this all up is that, after covering the script in more detail, I don't know if Nojima actually intended the episode to read like this at all. As we covered with the larger point with Frill here, Nojima is really good at removing all subtext from his script by just essentially writing some random stupid stuff. In his interviews, Nojima refers to Frill with a sort of a handwave, and analyzing the episode itself, there really is no critical commentary of any kind that it even suggests that we can treat the conflict with Frill as something that has more nuance beyond her just being the main antagonist. So ultimately I'm guessing that the reason I feel like there's some sort of subtext happening here is because the staff at Cloverworks read the script in a way that, every regular human being would read, and the episode direction tries to hammer in the nuance here that Nojima's script lacks. In the script alone, you're probably supposed to take all of these things at face value, and there's even a teen who falls in love with an older man, which is basically Nojima leaving his calling card at this point, so bravo maestro. With these ideas planted in our brain, let's look back at one of the core things we skirted around, namely, how the story treats this Patrick Bateman teacher dude. There's this really strange tension here, which is brought by the vague idea that the teacher might be romantically involved with some of his students. The series very consciously elevates this as a conflict. Our protagonist, it seems, also has some romantic feelings towards the teacher, too. Some people debate this. I think the signs are pretty clear. The work isn't really subtle about that. There's also this really funny scene, where Bateman is portrayed in some boy band music video. It probably slipped into the wrong anime. Now, by the last episode, we're treated to an exposition dump on how this teacher, actually, had nothing to do with character deaths, and Ai's friend turned out to be a very bad person herself, and eventually, she, I guess, slipped from the roof. My guess, and yeah, this is just guesswork, would be that these scenes where the teacher is portrayed in a negative light exist either because the Cloverworks staff had no idea themselves whether Bateman would turn out to be evil or not, or because before Nojima chose to introduce Frill, the main conflict was planned to revolve around this teacher anyway. Now, to be frank, I think it's perfectly okay to have your implicit evil here turn out to be something else. It's entirely fine to recontextualize your characters in some meaningful way. But the key word here is meaningful. And, considering the context, what I think we have here is just another Nojima twist that serves only to flatten the landscape. Look, for example, there's this scene where the teacher shows Ai a painting of herself that's aged up in some sort of fucked up way, and the teacher simultaneously goes on a rant to gush over how beautiful older Ai looks like, and narratively, we're still on the fence here on whether this guy has a fridge full of severed heads or not. Especially considering the painting is named Latent Heat. This really serves to put all these events to the same framework Nojima uses to approach Frill, one of his more unhinged points of sorts, that children have this untamed sexual energy to them, essence of femininity. So, to put it plainly, this scene sexualizes Ai, right? But putting on the Nojima nightmare goggles here, I guess the real point of this scene was just to showcase that an aged up Ai looks exactly like her mother. So you're supposed to read this scene as a revelation that, yeah, this dude's clean, and is just really into hot MILFs in your area. The point quickly becomes a somewhat patronizing denial of all the implications over this dude being a predator, while delivering that point in a context that's implicitly extremely predatory. But he says that's not the case, so I guess you better take his word for it. So again, don't read the implications, just look at the surface. And look, just to be more clear about this, my point here isn't that Wonder Egg would necessarily be a much better work if Nojima had just set out to write a story where this teacher is somehow culpable. It might have maybe made a tonally more consistent story, especially if you ditch this stupid painting scene, and there are ways to deliver societal commentary without making your male cast irredeemable villains. The point I'm trying to make with all this is that Nojima's writing here is extremely flat, as his style is very direct, to the point where everything he writes can, and maybe should, be taken at face value, as there are no implications here that anything deeper is even going on. Nothing we have described gives the impression that he is the right person to write a story that deals with extremely complex and extremely personal topics, in an anime that is, at least on a visual level, gunning for some symbolic approach. For one, the Nojima Nightmare Goggles reveal that there is just simply no commentary to be made over teenagers falling in love with older men. It's just a thing that happens, multiple times during any given work. Moreover, he doesn't think that locking children in your basement is something to make moral evaluations over. And he certainly isn't willing to reflect any of this to build a point of any kind. Nojima is often described to be a writer that approaches controversial topics and relies on shock value, and based on Wonder Egg, I think that happens because he just legitimately has nothing else to say about these things than the superficial grotesque. He likes poking at the beehive, but he has no plans of any kind beyond that. And I think everything we have in Wonder Egg really supports that idea, to the point where all the additional story twists only serve to retroactively remove anything even resembling an understanding of the themes he's recycling in his works. So at the end of the day, with all the production issues the studio faced, it's really up to you how much you want to play the devil's advocate for Nojima here. I consider him to be like 95% culpable, but that's because I'm more interested in reception and the story here. Maybe we can, at least according to some people, quit fixating on Nojima, and recognize the issues in the in-studio work culture, or the suits on top. Maybe the primordial slime should have just stuck to the bottom of the sea. But maybe we can also take this moment to recognize that whatever Wonder Egg ultimately turned out to be, is irreversibly linked with the worldviews of an old man, who's operating under the impression that he can totally reuse some contrived soap opera plotlines to write an original anime, and thinks that this all will somehow connect him to a younger generation of media consumers he sympathizes with only on a very superficial level. Superficial enough to think that it makes more sense to explain the headspace of teens with a goddamn robot twist, instead of portraying the characters struggling in the very same society that his very own generation has shaped to be one of the most uninhabitable social environments on Earth. And I admit, it's sometimes very difficult to understand Zoomers. You seem to spend your free time just recording these dance videos on Chinese spy platforms, right? Isn't that what the kids are up to these days? So instead of trying to make sense of all this, it's much more tempting to portray teenage girls as a sort of an emotional black hole, where robot science serves to explain all of this, and, as it turns out, little girls are also just ontologically evil. Pinocchio. We've now discussed Nojima in length, so let's, at the end of all this, focus on an important topic that I think got thrown out somewhere with the bathwater. Namely, at the end of the day, did the anime fail in some abstract way, and is it a bad piece of fiction? First, let's take a look at the popular reception. We already know there are a lot of reviews clowning on the show, and that's me included, to some extent, I guess? But I was curious to see if these very aggressive reviews represented some wider consensus. Now, I used my anime list as a quick indicator of the reception, and yeah, I'm not saying you can use the scoring on this site to draw any conclusions about, say, overall quality, especially considering that the list of top 10 anime of all time still has like just 7 different Gintama entries. But this score here is perfectly serviceable in showing that there was an actual change of the popular opinion. Interestingly enough, the episode with Frill, script-wise being the most blatant turning point, didn't cause a big stir, and the scores start to dip only after episode 12, until eventually settling to the 7-ish the series sits on today. It's also important to note that as episode 13 was aired as a special, my anime list has a separate entry for it, and it sits at 5 or so, which ranks it lower than, say, Recap of Texhnolize. If we were to put that to this visual chart I have, we can see that, Firstly, the overall series score would look like this, and secondly, I should have gotten a better chart. And again, I have to stress, this alone does not mean that the series is objectively bad. But it just means we have observable statistics to show that people really were disappointed by the ending, and there isn't any kind of a psyop going on when people refer to the series as something that started tanking towards the end. Maybe you disagree with the series dipping in quality, that's fine. But the popular opinion really seems to be like this. And maybe more interestingly, it seems your average viewer didn't really perceive problems with the series or the production before the series hit the final stretch, as before that, the series rating remains quite stable. Considering the recaps and all the stuff, I kind of assumed there would be an earlier drop, but I guess you pick up the things I listed on the production timeline only if you're going through the series with a magnifying glass. But aside that all, curiously enough, and I have to point this out, when we take a look at the people who actually worked with the series, there's a certain, let's say, tonal blindness to the overall popular reception here. Nojima's opinions are of course so out of touch that they don't represent any observable reality. But taking a look at some of the other staff, there seems to be a surprising general trend that the creators themselves view Wonder Egg in a very positive light. Even one of the staff interviews I frequently referred to is named, "What Made Wonder Egg Such a Special Anime?" and title is delivered fully without the kind of snark it might have very well implied. Of course, as we covered before, there's bound to be some PR speak here, as the creators are of course representing their product. But that aside, being less cynical about all this, there seems to be some legitimate fondness towards the anime here. I mean, even the infamous hospital tweets portray the anime as something that's worth more than the creator's life. I earlier described this a totalitarian tweet, but to be fair, I don't think there was any real coercion or the try to keep up any of the appearances here. There's an obvious attempt to score some tough guy points by flaunting your hardship, but regardless, I think the point in this, and in everything going on in the studio, is that especially the people on charge of the project at Cloverworks had a real sense of commitment to this anime. Obviously that kind of positive attitude isn't true for everyone involved. We for example have leaks on some animators ranting anonymously how bad the overall production was. But for a lot of people here, there seems to be a clear sense of passion project here, with all the negatives that come with the territory, of course. And in a way, that's the worst part about Wonder Egg. The fact that there was a clear attempt behind this all, and that the anime itself wasn't just a calculated corporate scheme, but an attempt to write an original story that on a production level gave a chance to a lot of talented new people to shine and make their marks on the industry. So it's very disappointing to see the eventual reception, not only because it reflects on how I, or anyone else, views the anime in hindsight, but because it's yet another underlining on how original works just really struggle in the industry, and how it's often easier for corporate suits to put money behind projects that don't have even the half of the artistic ambition that Wonder Egg had on a conceptual level. This leads us to our next question. Does this all that we've discussed make Wonder Egg a bad anime then? If I had to approach this series somehow in a form of a review, the first hurdle would of course be that Wonder Egg is an extremely mixed bag. There's no escaping the fact that the script has these Nojima-sized smudges that sometimes just decide to, I don't know, inspect robotics to practically no outcome at all. But the part about this all being a mixed bag is of course that you still have the underlying positives here. And in a way, that's exactly what's so sad about this anime, as I want to move on with my life already, but this script has taken me hostage on some messed up spiritual level. And what I mean by that is of course that there's no way I can reduce Wonder Egg to being a holistically bad anime just because the script starts to spin out of control. This video wouldn't be so long if I could just shrug off the series that easily. Judging from the popular reception alone, it's really easy to get the impression that the entire show is a giant house fire, but playing the contrarian here, I truly don't think that's the case. As we mentioned before, for many people working at Cloverworks, Wonder Egg was a passion project, and this is clearly visible, at least if you just ignore the lowest lows of the work for a while. Even now, if you watch the first episode, without context, you can still pick up what promises the series had, and where it delivered, consistently, since episode 1. Mixed in with a very strong visual direction, you have these characters that, at best of times, seem very human, and the way they interact with the world, and each other, has snippets of the kind of confident storytelling that many even more highly praised series simply lack. The show of course receives fair share of criticism over obvious visual symbolism, but at the same time, there's a huge amount of visual cues that serve only to underline the emotional framework on a character level. For example, Sakuga blog goes as far as to analyze how the way the characters interact with doors reflects the degree of their character development. Things like this are easily reflective of the best parts of the series, and let me be blunt again, there's absolutely no way something like this was included in Nojima's original script, and what we're seeing here is definitely the Cloverworks staff trying to deal with the gaps in the script, putting their best foot forward to deliver something that's more charming and more human than the rest of the script that, sadly, was doomed from the start to involve Nojima as part of the production. But pointing out details like this, you just have to forget where the series started slipping and sliding towards the end, and whether you're willing to entertain such self-delusions, or just, I don't know, move on with your life and watch some other anime, is of course fully up to your own discernment. But playing the devil's advocate here, I truly don't consider even the infamous special episode to be worth its current score of 5 out of 10. It's of course easily the weakest part of the series, no doubt, but I feel like there's a bit of bandwagoning going on here. Despite the troubled production, there's still a few really great cuts in the special alone, like this one. I don't have the brainpower left to properly explain why this rough cut has stayed with me all these years. But looking back at something as specific as the actual plotline now, even most of the things people usually rail against, or even consider minor plot holes, all these things can still be read as an honest attempt to write a conclusion for the characters, even if, ultimately, that conclusion ends up being your average, vaguely artsy, somewhat open-ended rush job. Which, admittedly, can be aggravating. You see, it's things like this that make Wonder Egg a really tough sell. I really tried to defend the finale here, but even that will eventually amount to a roundabout, it could be worse. Which, it realistically could, right? I don't consider Egg to be a bad series as a whole, but if I were to recommend someone the series for what it is, I'd have to lace that recommendation with so many roundabout disclaimers, and even after talking all this time, none of those disclaimers would probably even begin to serve as a proper commentary on the aftertaste the series finale really leaves in your mouth. But the point is, it's fun to dogpile on this show as there are script details here that basically write all the jokes for you, but it's good to remember that there is an actual anime under here, that, for what it's worth, for a while, was the unarguable focal point of all the anime original productions, and something that the world had eyes on, as a showcase and a promise on what artistic minds could produce if all the stars aligned, even if they, ultimately, didn't. So, do I recommend Wonder Egg? Well, it's the type of a, no, but actually, sorta deal for me. Maybe just, decide for yourself. If you're one of the people who hasn't seen Wonder Egg at this point, and this video made you interested, like, at all, then if you go into the series with the mindset that you acknowledge the work for what it is, a visually pleasing, but very flawed anime, then you might find something of value, and something, at least, a bit enjoyable. Something that might start living rent-free in your head too. Even if as a work of fiction, Wonder Egg is an anime equivalent of a controlled flight into terrain. And at the end of the day, I think that's all I really want to say about reviewing this anime. So now, maybe I'll just continue with my life and try to move past this crash. And maybe, just maybe, listen to the director's final plea, and once in a while, for a moment in my life, look back at the anime, and remember it for what it was. But now, we've covered basically everything worth covering, without even going into ludicrous detail on color palettes or close episode readings, or the fact that someone in the staff has a barely hidden foot fetish. I'm thinking Nojima. It's always just this guy, isn't it? So it's good to reflect on what kinda journey my obsessive search for answers has been. For one, the eventual story wasn't just a mystery. For that part, we have discovered a culprit of some kind, and all that it entails. But what we have here is also a pretty tragic story of an anime that really could have been something, well, less messy, if it just had been born under a set of different circumstances. And moreover, it's an anime that, despite the very obvious flaws, had a lot of talent, vision, and passion backing up the aspects in the craft that had, arguably, some salvageable merit in here. Overall, this video really wasn't what I expected it to be when I started writing up the script. In this postmodern hellscape, it's almost refreshing to peer behind the production curtain and find something to point your finger at, because otherwise we live in a world that's so interconnected, so interlinked, so complex, that individual people and the authorship in general all become muddled in, ideally, a well-oiled machine that far surpasses any personal goals, personal meanings, personal ambitions, just because the process itself, and the societal backdrop, seems too large to even properly comprehend. So in a way, it's extremely refreshing to look at all this, and walk away with the conclusion that there's something discernible at fault here. I think, At the end of the day, this underlines why it's even somewhat easy to empathize with Nojima and this really stupid script he wrote. Even though he's obviously out of touch with anime, out of touch with working in this production pipeline, out of touch with writing psychological stories, severely out of touch with the very people he's trying to portray, there's still some honest and authentic gut perspective here. An autopsy of an old man that screams terror in the face of a world that you're trying to understand, and how tempting it is to flatten this all out to a form that serves an easy villain. So yes, I'm using the same exact trick here that I fault Nojima for. He's my Frill at the end of the story, someone I can freely blame. The only difference to me is that Nojima is dealing with fantasy worlds, and we're dealing with a remarkable production crash. So, like the colossal hypocrite I am, I think it's time to write a surprise twist to top this video off. I can finally reveal that this video, for me, wasn't really an attempt to analyze anime production, or the deeper, underlying issues in Japanese society. This video was just a fucking Pinocchio allegory.
I am the Eggman, that's what I am. I am the Eggman, I got the master plan. I am the Eggman, that's what I am. I am the Eggman with the master plan. The story begins with who's gonna win, knowing the danger that lies within. A boy, the art, the genius at heart, wanting to unlock the mysteries of life. I'm plotting my schemes wherever. God!
それ以来、私はこたつと翼と野島真司のトラウマを背負ってるんだ。